As you guys know, I am new in DC. I've just started here. My wife and I are separated, getting a divorce, and new into the area. And so one of the agendas was to meet new people in the area. Not trying to date or anything like that, not necessarily in the headspace, but definitely to meet new people that are basically in the area. So at one of the dispensaries nearby, there's a woman who is really into Star Trek. And every time we're there, we get the opportunity to talk and everything else. And so my thought was, okay, well, give her your information. Maybe you guys can get coffee. Again, not trying to hit on her, but just definitely wanting people interaction, if that makes sense. She seems interested. A day passes, 4 days pass, and I'm like, what just happened? What just happened? I mean, like, what just happened? And so my mind immediately, you start thinking, okay, well, there was clear interest. So was it the channel? And so I started thinking, okay, was it something on the YouTube channel that might have been it? Like, meaning a point of view, for example, on Ukraine, especially with the tenor and the way that Western media is kind of tilted in the way that they've been framing these events. I don't know if that's true. Could be, maybe, maybe not. But either way, it presents two problems. One, got to find another dispensary. It is astonishingly awkward to ever go back to that dispensary. That is never going to take place again. But beyond that point, and more importantly, she would be wrong. And just like her, and I'm not picking on her if that's what it is. I don't even know if that's what it is. But there's a perspective on the left, especially this kind of democratic-leaning left, that gets the Ukraine issue wrong. The reason why it started, and those that are culpable, and basically propagating it. And more importantly, on that particular issue, if you're getting it wrong in regards to how this basically started and who is responsible, you can never really accrue blame and indignation at the various people who were responsible for this catastrophe that is basically taking place in Europe. Again, I don't necessarily know if that was the reason for it, but I will use it as a pretext of a video to make the point that the Democratic left on the issue of Ukraine is extremely and bewilderingly wrong. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. Yeah, I'm going to use this as a video because I've been seeing, look, it feels like I am in a Black Mirror episode, and I know I've said this before. The media is giving a warped point of view of not just how this happened, not just why it happened, not just why it's continuing to go on, but even on things like the battlefield and what is taking place on the ground. Has been warped. If you're looking at Ukrainian media, Russian media, or even Chinese media, you get a more well-rounded picture, not to mention Telegram channels and people who are basically on the ground. It's not what they're reporting. Now, beyond that point, there's all sorts of context and holes that are basically left out of that particular narrative. The point I'm making here is that the media in this country is reporting it in a particular way. So I get why somebody's framing in the way that they're looking at this conflict may go in a particular direction. It's like, oh, Russia's totally responsible. Oh, Russia wanted to entirely take Ukraine. They've always wanted to take Ukraine. Putin is a madman. He doesn't have security concerns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you're an anti-war lefty, I am not certain if it's a situation where the person doesn't entirely understand the context of this war, why it started, why it's continuing to go on, this kind of geopolitical consequences and this gamesmanship that's basically taking place with people's lives being used basically as pawns in that particular game. Or for that matter, whether it's a form of virtue signaling where this kind of external pressure is pushing them to take a certain position that, I gotta be honest, seems like a contradiction in terms. Meaning, to take this framing, where you're more so in line with the democratic position on Ukraine, feels like a contradiction, especially from the standpoint of an anti-war lefty. And just because you're an anti-war lefty doesn't necessarily mean you're belligerently blind to practical realities of life as those life present themselves, where there's an action and there's a consequence, and there are other people with certain objectives that are run contrary to your own. You still have a world that you have to deal with. Reality doesn't necessarily care about your ideology. So, yes, you can hate war, and I appreciate that. And any anti-war lefty, all things being equal, would either want to prevent wars, want to stop those wars once those wars get started, and whatever power necessary to basically eliminate the incentives that basically are provoking the war in the first place. Okay. Because of that position, the anti-war left takes a position of basically criticizing the United States. And it criticizes the U.S. because we're a belligerent nation. We're pretty violent. We knock over governments. We have coups where we need to get particular leaders out. I mean, look at the number of coups that this government has basically pushed forward. Even beyond that point, look at Iraq. Look at Syria. Look at Libya. I mean, we basically set the Middle East on fire. Look at Yemen right now, or for that matter, Afghanistan. Do you believe that the people who are in those offices are nice, kind people? And I understand that because they're your president, you're accustomed to them, you know them. But if another person, just like was sitting there like Madeleine Albright and said, yeah, 500,000 kids dying was worth it in Iraq, worth it. What would you think of that person? I get that she's Madeleine Albright and you know her in that sense. But think of the words she's saying. If Saddam Hussein had said, yeah, those 500,000 kids dying are worth it, what would you think about Saddam Hussein in that very specific situation? I'm saying that your people are also monsters. When Bill Clinton or when George Bush goes in and gets 1 million Iraqis killed in a war of aggression and then goes to the next country and the next country with the notion of looking at Iran, do you believe these people are good, kind, moral people, or do you believe they're sociopaths that are perfectly in this mindset of the world is a chessboard and our objective is to get more and more power? If that means people lose their lives, so be it. And why do I say that? I mean, look at the number of lives that were lost in Afghanistan or in Iraq or Syria with those drone bombings that Obama was basically using. 500,000 people died in that Syrian conflict with Obama egging that stuff on because he wants to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. Again, do you think these people are kind, moral, and nice? Or do you think these people are sociopaths with a certain mindset of this notion of power and accruing more geopolitical power? And there seems to be a continuity, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, on that very specific point of pursuing those particular objectives. And so, if this is the world that you criticize, you got to accept that. And what I'm saying by that, these people aren't dandelions. These people aren't, tulips. They have very specific objectives in mind. And if you look at one conflict after the next, you look at the number of people that were killed in those conflicts, and you ask whether or not our actions were justified and why those actions were being taken place. Was it really for the betterment of somebody else, or was it for our own self-interest? I'm trying to frame the country for you and the way that the anti-left typically frames U.S. action. All right, great. Put a pin in that. Enter Ukraine, or enter NATO in Ukraine. Soviet Union falls. On top of the Soviet Union falls, NATO continues to go on. Not just continues to exist. When the Soviet Union fell, they were given assurances that we wouldn't pick over the corpse and that we would not expand NATO 1 inch to the east. And we, of course, ignored both of those things promptly with shock capitalism that basically killed hundreds of thousands of Russians. And on top of the shock capitalism, you had the situation of NATO basically continuing to expand up to the border of Russia. Didn't have to do those things. They chose to do those things. On top of that, you get this other situation where they basically knock over the government of Ukraine. They get rid of the Yanukovych government in 2014 because Yanukovych wouldn't necessarily get closer to the EU in a trade deal that was going to be to the worst end for Ukraine, as opposed to working with Russia where they were going to get a better deal. This was too far, and you had U.S. working with literal neo-Nazis in order to violently overthrow the government of Ukraine, with Victoria Nuland helping choose who is going to be in a new government. We're going to midwife this thing in the way that she said it. Everything that I just said is true. And so you have a Russophobic government that is now in power, that is basically pushed by the U.S., that is on the border of Russia, and has started to basically integrate itself with NATO, not necessarily in fact, but definitely indeed, and a number of weapons, training, munitions, and everything else basically sitting on the border. Again, none of these things needed to happen. All of these things were done for reasons. Do you think those reasons were innocuous? I mean, after all, we went over the first section, the framing to which the anti-left typically sees its government, do you think that one action after the next that was basically taken here, meaning in Europe, do you think it was innocuous? And the answer, of course, is no. None of the stuff was innocuous. All of these things were done for geopolitical power. Our rule in the U.S. was that there would never be another power that would rival us again to the level of the Soviet Union. But understand what that means. It means that you are basically at odds with any country to which you don't necessarily control and that is not necessarily a vassal state, or at the very least, that you don't have a huge amount of influence in the country. Russia being one of those countries. China being another one of those countries. Both of those countries at this point are rivaling the U.S. in such a way where we are getting insecure, and they are basically taking actions to do something about it. Now, from the standpoint of NATO expanding, understand the reason why it's expanding. The objective is to put the country in a position where one or two things happens. Either you allow yourself to be encircled, where any conflict that kicks off, you are basically militarily surrounded and it is a fait accompli. Or you do something about it. Now, in the case of Ukraine, William Burns, CIA director, made the point of saying, look, if we keep pushing this notion of NATO in Ukraine, then there may be a civil war where Russia would have to get involved, but it would not like to get involved in. And he also notes on this notion of encirclement. It is a Hobbes choice. At the point where the government is overthrown, we could have backed and pushed our vassal state to support the Minsk II agreements. Again, we didn't do that. At the point where Russia was pleading, say you will not be part of NATO, what did these guys do? They took the maximalist position. And despite the fact that all of them behind the scenes were telling Zelensky he would never be part of NATO, none of them would say it aloud. One step after the next. They full well understood that this was a red line, but in their heads, one or two things are going to happen. Either they're going to allow themselves to be encircled, or they're going to involve themselves into a conflict, and using that as a pretext to basically launch an economic war. No, those things are not going well. That is secondary to the point of what the objective was and what these guys were doing from the standpoint of the actions that they were basically taking. These are provocative actions. Do you believe these actions were innocuous? Not just innocuous, do you believe that when Cuba or Russia or the Soviet Union was putting missiles in Cuba, do you believe that those missiles aimed at the United States were innocuous missiles? And why do you believe that the United States reacted so harshly, meaning we are in the world if you keep those missiles there? Why do you think they acted that way? Because no sovereign country would allow itself to be encircled in such a way where any military conflict is a fait accompli. It is a security concern. The U.S. even took the position that Russia has no security concerns. This is what they were saying, people who we were under normal circumstances that the left calls sociopaths, and who we've seen take set fire to the globe in one country after the next. If you're in Moscow, you're sitting in Moscow, you're looking at that, you're looking at all of these events that are taking place. You're seeing these people take action after action after action to get themselves closer and closer to your border, to put weapons that much closer to your country. They've gotten rid of the altered security agreements, meaning from the standpoint of the missile treaties. What do you think? These people are sociopaths. He knows it. He floats in this bunch. And now you have a situation where the Ukrainians military integrate the neo-Nazis. And to make it worse, the Ukrainian government calls the Russian-speaking Ukrainians terrorists and goes on a killing spree, basically attacking those Russian speakers. Now, this begins to escalate to the point where Putin, yes, we recognize those republics as independence. Understand why the republics declare independence, though. When Yanukovych was basically sacked and violently overthrown, they called it a revolution of dignity. The democratically elected president that was elected by the Russian speakers in the East and the Ukrainian in the West, both of which are Ukrainians, but one Russian speakers are, for the matter, ethnic Russians. The legitimate government collapsed. The moment that the legitimate government collapsed and the Russophobic government came in, the people who were in the East were not unaware of what was taking place and did not want to be under a Russophobic government that was basically led by the United States. This is exactly what William Burns was talking about. They provoked a civil war. NATO didn't have to extend membership to Ukraine back in 2008. All of them, again, understood that this was a red line. All of them continued to do it. The point that I'm getting here is that the group of people who in Section A, we at the very least agree under normal circumstances are sociopaths, are provoking a conflict on this kind of geopolitical scale that created a security concern. Now, there's some people where we're having this particular case of this argument, they would downplay this kind of threat of NATO. But at the very least, everything that I just said there was true. And not just true, if you have an honest assessment of that, that is called provocation. If it's something that we ourselves wouldn't necessarily accept, why would we think that another country would accept it? And considering that going back to 2008, William Burns was talking about what is taking place right now. And even before that, the red line comment gets across that all of them understood that this was a pressure point. None of them did anything to mitigate it. Only thing they did was take maximalist position in order to inflame it that much further. And now, after inflaming it, we're now dumping in $40 billion on top of another $10 billion. EU is sending in another, $15 billion. They give it all the weapons, munitions, bullets, everything else that they can get their hands on in order to help them keep the war going, in order to kill and bleed the Russian military white. The strategy has been used once before in Afghanistan with Mujahideen. What is it? Charlie Wilson's war goes into it, gives it a glossy point of view on it. Those people ended up becoming Al-Qaeda. But whatever, those call blowback. The point that I'm making here, though, is these were actions of provocation. And it was the fact that these actions of provocation were taking place that was causing a security concern. Now, you can downplay the threat that NATO causes. You can downplay that Ukraine was never going to really be part of NATO. I don't know why people think Russia should believe that. Again, considering the point of view that Moscow has of the events that are basically taking place. But the left, if you're an anti-war left, looks like you would have to regard that. Meaning you would have to acknowledge on some level that, okay, fair enough, that's a provocation. Those things are aggressive actions, and those things can be threatening to the country itself. The moment that you get to that point, okay, then who provoked? Who caused this? And if you on some level can agree that there's culpability, even if you say, well, I don't think Russia should win it, okay, fair enough. But at the very least, we need to accept and acknowledge that there's a certain amount of culpability from the standpoint of the West in regards to the actions that they were taking. One provocative action after the next that all of them understood was going to be a red line, and all of them did it anyway. Now, in this situation, when Zelensky tried to make a peace deal, what happened? Boris Johnson gives him a visit, representing the West. Yeah, you're going to need security guarantees from us, and we're not really going to give you those. You even get the situation where Western media says quiet part out loud. Hey, the quiet truth is that many of the NATO nations would prefer Ukraine fight to the last dead Ukrainian. They want to bleed the Russian military, basically, or degrade the Russian military. We are in a literal proxy war where the United States is funding the Ukrainian war effort against Russia. Joe Biden just put through a Lend-Lease bill. Where's Ukraine going to get the money to pay that back? They're being balkanized. Many of the areas to which, let's say, are valuable are basically being taken at this point. I mean, it is a war after all. We're funding a war effort against Russia. Think about that. I guess my point here is there's a context to why this war started. And if you're looking at this from the standpoint of an anti-left and you're like, I want to prevent wars, okay, hey, that's a provocation. That's something that seems to be something that you would want to prevent in the first place, or at the very least acknowledge. And in the second place, even if you don't necessarily like the war, I'm not saying love the war. Nobody likes John Bolton, maybe. But you get my point. It's not necessarily something that people raw. But whether you raw it or not, it is something that is taking place. And there was somebody or groups who were responsible, more than others, for pushing it. My point is, culpability matters. And whatever you want to think about Putin is kind of secondary to the point about whether or not he is more responsible than the countries in the West that basically was taking those provocative actions one after the next, and then using propaganda to assuage their societies, to prevent a legitimate point of view of basically what was taking place that was far more complicated than what they were basically presenting. The left is wrong on this. They're wrong on this. Look, again, if you're an anti-war lefty, on some level, you should want to be able to stop this. And the catch is, who are the purveyors of this war going forward? Now, yes, Russia invaded. On top of that, though, is there any chance for peace? And more importantly, is there any chance for peace with the West, U.S., and NATO countries dumping as many weapons into Ukraine as possible. And understand, the reporting that has basically been coming out has been talking about the condition of the Ukrainian military. That doesn't even touch the fact that the Ukrainian economy is basically collapsing. And yet, here's more guns, here's more bullets, here's more fuel. Keep fighting. My point is, the people who provoked the war are also the people that are keeping the war going on. And so again, whatever you want to think about Putin, one opportunity after the next was given in order to avert this particular disaster. And at no point did anyone in the West want to prevent this disaster, and if anything, inflamed it that much more in order to get their opportunity for this economic war that is going so monstrously well. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I mean, I don't want to be too long. I guess my point is, you got to regard it honestly. I don't necessarily care what your take is on Putin. That's almost secondary to the point. Does the country have security concerns? And at the point where you have all of these nations that have basically decided we're going to ally ourselves in order to target this one very specific nation, because the West is insecure about this notion of hegemony, there being a hegemon, especially with the competition they're getting from China on the economic front, and with China and Russia combined on the military front, not to mention you add in India and all these other countries. Meaning the dominance of the U.S. has diminished. And in the context of it diminishing, there's this kind of weird geopolitical war to determine what the world is going to look like going forward. It's very strange, and that stuff is being fought on the banks of Ukraine. The point I'm making here is this far more complicated, far more gray, and any particular point of view that is saying, should we, how much are we willing to expend ourselves in order to basically keep a coup-inspired government in place and to keep that country in our orbit? We didn't have to take any of those actions. All of those actions were provocative. The left is getting this wrong. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I am going to say subscribe. Thanks all.